So this woman gets accused of causing her boyfriend's passing. He was a Boston police officer, and the case divides the entire country because half the people think she did it and the other half think she's being framed by corrupt cops. Her name is Karen Reed, and this story starts on a freezing January night in 2022 in Canton, Massachusetts, a quiet Boston suburb where the police community is really tight-knit and everyone knows everyone. Karen is a 44-year-old finance professional who's been in a relationship with John O'Keefe for about 2 years. John is a 16-year veteran of the Boston Police Department, well respected by his colleagues, and he's also a single father raising his niece and nephew after his sister passed away. So by all accounts, this guy is genuinely one of the good ones. On January 28, 2022, Karen and John go out to a local bar called Waterfall with some friends, having drinks and socializing, just a regular night out. Around 12:30 in the morning, they decide to head to an after party at 34 Fairview Road, which is the home of Brian Albert, a fellow Boston police officer and one of John's friends. Now here's where the story gets complicated. Karen drives John to the house in her black Lexus SUV, but according to her version of events, she never actually goes inside. She says she drops John off because she's tired and wants to go home. He gets out of the car and she leaves, expecting he'll get a ride back later or she'll pick him up. Karen goes home and falls asleep. And when she wakes up around 5 in the morning, she realizes John never came home and isn't answering his phone. She starts panicking, calling and texting repeatedly, and then she drives back to 34 Fairview Road since that's the last place she saw him. When she arrives at the house around 6 a.m. while it's still dark, she sees something that absolutely horrifies her. There's a body lying in the snow on the front lawn. She rushes over and realizes it's John, unconscious, covered in snow, with visible injuries, and he's clearly been outside in the freezing temperatures for hours. Karen immediately calls for emergency help, and she's completely hysterical, saying things that later become key evidence in the case. Paramedics arrive and transport John to the hospital, but he's pronounced deceased shortly after arrival. The medical examiner determines the cause was hypothermia and blunt force trauma. Now, based on Karen's emergency call and the fact that John was found outside the house where she dropped him off, police immediately focused their investigation on Karen. Their theory is that Karen and John had an argument after leaving the bar, and when she dropped him off at 34 Fairview Road, she was angry and either accidentally or intentionally struck him with her vehicle, then left him there in the cold. They find damage to her Lexus taillight, which they say matches what you'd expect from this type of incident, and they find some of John's hair and clothing fibers on her vehicle. Karen is arrested and charged with serious offenses, including causing someone's passing and leaving the scene. The prosecution's case seems pretty straightforward based on her own statements, the vehicle damage, and the physical evidence. But then Karen's defense team starts investigating, and what they discover turns this whole case into something that sounds like a conspiracy movie. Karen's lawyers, led by a prominent attorney named Alan Jackson, argue that Karen had nothing to do with John's passing, that John actually went inside 34 Fairview Road for the party, something happened to him inside that house, and then his body was placed on the front lawn to make it look like Karen was responsible. They claim this is a massive cover-up by Boston area law enforcement to protect their own people. The defense presents evidence that raises serious questions about the official story. First, they point out that John's injuries don't match what you'd typically expect from a vehicle incident. He has injuries that look more consistent with other causes, and the defense suggests the family's German Shepherd dog may have been involved. Second, they discover that Brian Albert, the homeowner, who's also a police officer, sold his house and rehomed his dog just weeks after John's passing, which the defense argues is suspicious timing, like he's trying to eliminate potential evidence. Third, they find that multiple people at that party, all with law enforcement connections, gave statements that don't line up with each other, and there's evidence that phone data from that night may have been deleted. Fourth, the defense brings in accident reconstruction specialists who examine Karen's vehicle and John's injuries, and these experts conclude that the damage and injuries aren't consistent with the prosecution's version of events. They argue the taillight was damaged intentionally to frame her. As all this information becomes public, the case absolutely explodes on social media and in the news. Thousands of people start showing up to protest outside the courthouse, holding signs supporting Karen, and accusing law enforcement of corruption. The movement grows so large that it gets national media coverage, with people analyzing every piece of evidence and every statement that gets released. The community becomes completely divided. You have people who knew John demanding accountability and believing Karen is responsible. And you have people who believe Karen is being wrongly accused by corrupt officials trying to protect whoever actually harmed John inside that house. Karen's first trial begins in 2024 and it's a massive media event. The prosecution maintains their version of events, playing the emergency call repeatedly, showing the vehicle damage, and presenting the medical examiner's conclusions. But the defense systematically challenges the prosecution's case, bringing expert after expert who testify that the injuries don't match the alleged cause, showing evidence suggesting a cover-up, pointing out all the questionable behavior by the party attendees, and arguing that Karen's statements were just her panicking and assuming she must have accidentally did something wrong, not an actual admission of responsibility. The jury deliberates for days and ultimately cannot reach a unanimous decision. Some jurors believe the prosecution, others believe the defense, and the judge has to declare a mistrial. The case gets scheduled for a second trial in April 2025, and once again the entire nation is paying attention. The retrial brings even more revelations. The defense uncovers evidence that a lead investigator may have conducted unusual online searches about cold weather effects on the human body. And these searches allegedly happened before John's body was even discovered, which raises questions about foreknowledge. They also present testimony from witnesses who claim they saw John inside the Albert house that night, which directly contradicts the prosecution's timeline that he never entered. Social media goes absolutely wild with theories. Some people think Karen is completely innocent and being set up. Others think she's responsible, but the investigation was so poorly handled that it's impossible to know the truth anymore. And some think the reality is somewhere in between these extremes. The second trial continues for weeks with both sides presenting evidence that seems convincing, but tells completely different stories, and finally the jury reaches their verdict. Karen Read is found not responsible for the most serious charge, but is convicted on a lesser charge related to the vehicle incident, essentially saying they believe she was involved but didn't have intent to cause harm. She receives a sentence of several years, and both sides claim partial victory. Karen's supporters continue insisting she's innocent and promise to appeal, arguing that even this conviction is wrong. John O'Keefe's family expresses some relief that there's been a conviction, but struggles with the fact that so many questions remain unanswered about what really happened. And the general public is left wondering about the truth, whether this was a tragic accident, whether it's a case of corruption and cover-up, or whether the real story is something else that hasn't been fully revealed. What makes this case so fascinating and divisive is that both narratives have evidence supporting them. Both sides have credible specialists backing their claims, and depending on which evidence you find more convincing, you can reasonably believe completely different versions of what happened. It's a case that demonstrates how complicated finding truth can be, how institutional relationships can affect investigations, and how social media can turn a criminal trial into a national debate where everyone has an opinion, even though none of us were actually there that night.